Hi, my name is Keith Cooper, and in this video I'm just going to have a quick look at using the Canon TS-E17 tilt shift lens EF mount on the Fuji GFX100S 100 megapixel medium format sensor. Small medium format, that is, so 33 by 44 millimeter sensor, not the larger size you might be used to with medium format film. You can get larger sensors in digital cameras, but they become phenomenally expensive. This gives you a significant increase in imaging area, center area, over a 36 by 24 millimeter sensor. Now I'm using this with a Fotodiox adapter, and you get a choice with the camera. You can actually crop the image to a 36 by 24 proportion of the sensor, which gives you 3:2 format, or you can use the full 4:3 format for 33 by 44 millimeters of the medium format sensor there, so you get more of it. Why might you want to crop it? Well, your adapted lens might not be up to it. Your adapted lens may be fine for a smaller sensor, but you make a larger sensor, put it on it, and you get blurring and fall off vignetting in the corners. Now it turns out, and I tested the TS-E24mm lens with this as well, and that works very well. It turns out that tilt shift lenses, by their very nature, have a large image circle. That's the image projected at the back of the lens onto the sensor, and more than enough to work as a basic lens with the medium format sensor. That's great. Gives me a 17mm lens, roughly equivalent in 35mm terms of a 13mm lens, so a very wide lens. Now, it's a shift lens. That's the reason I use these things for architectural photography. If you're unfamiliar with shift lenses, and I'm not really covering tilt here in this, I will have a look at tilt in another short video. I've got a book that actually I've written that covers all about how to use these lenses. Yeah, it covers all lenses, 35mm and on medium format here as well. So it's got all the how to use it. Anyway, advert out of the way for that. How well does this perform? Well, not quite as well as the 24mm. Am I surprised by this? No. 13mm equivalent is a very wide angle, and you do lose a little bit of sharpness. Is it good enough to use? Yes, it is most definitely good enough to use as a shift lens. Tilt works as well with it, but say typically for these wide lenses you don't use tilt very often. But as I say, I will come back. I'll do another video looking at aspects of tilt. Shift is what most people want these ones for. So here's an image to start with. I went out for a walk down the river here in Leicester. Couple of buildings, classic sort of wide angle look to them, whereas this white building actually does have quite pronounced roof on it that curls up towards the edges. But you can see we've got quite an extreme view. Now, my eye level is about this far in the picture, so I've shifted the lens upwards, kept the camera level, used the internal level on the camera here, and I've got no converging verticals. Now that's what you generally use a shift lens for, certainly in architectural photography. Works well in landscape as well. Once I'm used to using shift lenses, wide lenses, I much prefer using them in landscape photography, particularly if I've got trees and I want the horizon low down in the frame. Because normally if you're taking shots, landscape type shots, and your horizon is away from the center, you're pointing the camera slightly upwards. With wide angles, well, with any lens you'll get convergence, but it shows up far more with the sort of things leaning in than that. So this camera's level, the lens is shifted upwards. Works very well. No real signs of vignetting. This is at about f9, f10. I find the lens works better without shift. You can get away with f6, f8. With match shift, if you've got detail in the corners, you probably want to go to F11. Now, I know some people will be throwing their hands up at the thought of using F11 on 102 megapixel sensor, diffraction and all that stuff. I don't care. It's about getting the image. Diffraction is not the bugbear that some people make it out to be. Yes, it's something you have to take notice of when you're doing high resolution imaging with big sensors like this, but it's not the frightening thing that some people seem to think it is. And I've said this before, if somebody asks me a question and they start off by quoting the exact figure at which diffraction becomes a problem on a particular sensor, a particular number of megapixels, then immediately that's sort of, I'm thinking, yeah, and your point is, have you actually ever taken photos with this? Actually taking photos trumps what people in forums tell you about what you can and can't do. It's amazing what you can do if you ignore the advice that some people like to give you. But anyway, there's a shot, bit of vertical. Now, this is full vertical shift. Now, this building on the river here, this is possibly a more attractive view of it than many. It's known locally as the Ministry of Truth building because it just looks so imposing, and I'm going to say out of place. And that's, I know the architects who designed it, so I won't go any more about it there. But this particular one with this much shift, you can see I'm relatively close to it, and I've had to push the lens fully upwards. The adjustments, the side adjustments are there to shove that fully upwards. I'm getting quite significant vignetting, and this is after I've tried to correct it a bit. I'll show some uncorrected examples as well. After I've tried to correct the vignetting. Now, vignetting from the edge of the image circle, when you do a vertical shift like that, you expect vignetting at the top corners because this is right at the edge of the image circle. But we're also getting vignetting at the bottom, and that is coming from the mount, the lens mount. One slight issue you'll get if you push the amount of shift too far, you will get vignetting in the opposite place to where you expect it. You would not expect to get vignetting here because the camera is pointing here. These areas here are well within the image circle. You'd not expect to get vignetting. That is caused by shadowing. Now, as you get your aperture gets smaller, so if I go to f11 as I would for a shot like this to try and keep it sharp, I'm going to start getting vignetting noticeable in these corners here. That's only if you push it at its absolute maximum. Now, this lens has got plus or minus 12 millimeters of shift. I would say that if you can keep that to 9 or less, you'll get very few vignetting problems. If you insist on using the full amount of shift, you will start to get vignetting issues. Depending on what part of the image is, what the subject is in it, it may or may not matter. Now, that's just something you're going to have to think about. I will be looking at it when it's here in the UK. Be looking at Fuji's upcoming 30mm tilt shift lens, native lens for this mount. That won't have any problems like this, but that's 30mm, which is equivalent in 35mm terms of a 24mm lens. So equivalent to my TS-E24, the one I did a video about earlier, on a normal camera. So with this one, the 24 gives the equivalent of about 19mm, 17 gives the equivalent of about 13mm. The 30 will give the equivalent of about a 24mm. Different frame ratio, aspect ratio, of course, so not entirely the same, but it gives you a feel for the sort of composition you'd get. That's why Fuji are bringing out a 30mm shift lens. I want something wider as well for occasions when I want shots like this. Now, I don't that often need shots like this, but when you do need them, you need them. Now, there is a little bit of other lens distortion as well, but it doesn't show that much in many images. It's just that you tend to find the 17 here is slightly less sharp, and I find this on 35mm as well, it's slightly less sharp than my 24mm. And if you go up to a 50mm lens on that, the TS-E50 is absolutely pin sharp. You go to the 90, the 135 as well. Now, I will have a look at the old TS-E90 in another video. That's where I mentioned I'd have a look at tilt, because it turns out that even that 1992 vintage 90mm tilt shift lens is absolutely superb on this sensor. So, yeah, if you're wondering about specialist lenses to get and thinking, well, Fuji don't make them, well, they're going to do a 30 and they're going to do a longer one as well, and so I'm going to be looking at those. But adapted lenses potentially work very well, and the acid test for me is, are these lenses good enough for me to use in my commercial architectural photography work? And I'm going to say, with care, yes. I'll show some aspects of why I say with care, but yes, so I would use. And also, I could always shoot in 35mm crop mode on this. I'm still generating 60 megapixel images, which are more than enough for most times I need it. So there really aren't any problems there, particularly if you get an adapter, a smart enough adapter that works all your EF lenses. And I have got some other EF lenses that if I get a chance before this one goes back, I will do some tests on a few other lenses, including some very old lenses. And they were quite surprising in their performance. But anyway, let's move on with this. This is, turns out the distortion you can get off this lens is very similar towards the edges to a slight bit of camera shake. Now, this has image stabilization on it, and so that's not a problem here, but the geometrical distortions, they're not covered by this. This is just sharpness distortions. It turns out that the distortions are very amenable to fixing with a tool such as Topaz Sharpen AI. Now, I've used it here. It's got the examples at the absolute corner of the image showing the amount of improvement you get. That is enough so that if I had to take a picture at that ultra wide angle, so 13mm with shift, if I had to take it with that, I know that I've got a lot of processing I can do. Now, on the Mac that I've got, this takes several minutes to do a 100 megapixel image to do it properly here, but it is doable, and that's important to know. And that's one of the things, if you've got a lens that you need to get the shot, knowing how that lens performs, how you can fix it, what you might have to do, what sort of work you might need to have to do on it, is vitally important. It's no good saying, oh, well, Keith, that means the lens is no good for that particular, that lens is no good for, for that particular use. Sometimes you need the lens you've got to get the image you want. And if that's the way of getting it, that's the way you have to work with it. There's nothing else that wide. There's the Laowa 15mm is very good as well. And the Laowa 20mm, so you've got a range of focal lengths you can apply for that. There, I've tested the 15 on this, and it works very well. So that's a bit of fixing of it. Image like that, which is just making use of the very wide angle, that's just got vertical shift. You can see my eye line is about here, so it's not shifted quite so much. We've got a bit of darkening at the top, but that doesn't really matter. We're getting the wide angle clouds running away to the corners look that you get with wide angle lenses when shifted like this, but that's just part of the look you get with it. There are ways of, you can use different ways of shift. You can use diagonal shift, which I'll mention in a moment, to change this look of it, but essentially it's a wide angle look. If you don't like the wide angle look, well, tough. That's what you're going to get from a wide angle lens. I use longer lenses, longer focal length lenses as well. It's whatever's appropriate for the image I'm taking. Remember, I often don't get a choice in some of the images I have to take. I'm asked to get images from a particular viewpoint, showing a particular aspect of a building, its location, people around it, its use, or something like that. That gives a constraint that I sometimes have to make the best of. Now, much more. Look, this one, the amount of shift on this, a reasonable amount of shift, probably about 9mm of shift on this, and we've got no significant problems with vignetting on it. The image is lovely and sharp. There is a tiny bit of lens flare just here, and that is because this bulbous front element on the lens here, you can't use a lens hood with it. If I'd have been thinking about this and doing it on an Aperture, I will have my hand in front of the lens to stop the sun hitting this front element. It's fairly good lens for it, but I've used it I've had this lens since 2007, and so I'm fairly used to how well it performs and when it's not quite at its best. But that's a straightforward shot of a hotel, and shot down the edge of it looking through. I'm making use of the fact I've lightened this quite a, to hold the sky here, detail in the clouds, and get this. I'm making use of the much better dynamic range I find on this than I would on my 5DS. Shots like this are ones that are just meant to look impressive. People might use them in brochures and things like that. When you're doing architectural photography, you always end up, obviously you take some shots because you've specifically been asked, but quite a lot of it is walking around looking and thinking, well, I think that shot would be interesting. And they don't all have to be absolutely perfect in getting the verticals straight, because a shot like this may not be of much interest to the architects, but who knows, the marketing department at the architect's practice might decide it's an image they want to use on the website somewhere. You never know. So I always end up taking more photos on an architectural job than are strictly asked for, because I've found that I've never had a complaint that I've sent too many photos in. I've only once ever had a complaint that I didn't send enough photos, and I was able to point to the brief that I'd been given, which specified 3 photos, and I'd sent like half a dozen. If you tell me you're going to take 3 photos, then I will take 3 photos for you. You're paying for the time, so and paying for the process, the effort in taking the pictures. So that's just being a commercial photographer. Just slightly different view of the same scene. Very strong lines in it. Once again, this has a fair bit of rise in it. It's probably about 10mm or so. It's not pushed at the top because I haven't got any obvious vignetting in it. So the lens is performing well. I've got lots of detail in it. That's great. There's this slightly strange building that from almost any angle looks a bit strange, clad in the sort of aluminium type look to it. This is taken with diagonal shift. The way I've done that is the camera is actually pointing here, off center, and the reason I've done that is because I want this particular bit of the building to be corrected vertically for leaning verticals, but also I want horizontal lines on it horizontal. Now the roof slopes, but the horizontal lines are all horizontal. Now if I point the camera here, I'm going to get all these cars in the picture. What I can do is point the camera where I want it and shift the lens diagonally to get more of the shot. Now I can see that this was taken diagonally because we've got no vignetting in this corner, and we've got distinct darkening in this corner here, and we've got a bit coming in on the opposite corner here. Remember, this bottom one here is the lens mount vignetting. This top one is the image circle itself is vignetting. So I've used diagonal shift there to control the perspective of this bit of the building whilst fitting the rest of this in. If that, a slightly better example of it would be just round the corner from it, and I'm looking here. This, no shift, nothing. I'm just pointing the camera straight along this walkway here. Now that's great, but I might not want all of this. I might not want this. I might want a different aspect of the shot. So that is with no shift. And the next one I'm going to show is shifting the lens diagonally upwards. And there we go. Now, as I mentioned before, so you've got a tiny little bit of vignetting here, and we've got a bit of vignetting here. This is because I pushed it to the extreme to show the effect. The camera is still looking down this walkway, so I can see it. It's framed nicely, but I've got more of this side of the building. You could equally well, if this side of the building was where the interesting bit is, you'd shift the other way. You can shift horizontally as well. So in doing that, you can use it to get rid of reflections of yourself in windows. There's all kinds of things you can do, but this one, notice we have horizontal lines are level, vertical lines are level. And that's from the use of the diagonal shift like that. I'll just go back to the other one. You can see there's the straight view, and there's no vignetting on that at all. So as a straight wide angle lens, roughly 13mm in 35mm terms, that is a, and if I go back, there's the diagonal shift. Now, it's full shift like that, so yeah, watch that bit of vignetting and the mount vignetting. But some of the things you can do with a lens like this. View here, no problem at all with the sun. I was holding the lens and just put my hand as a bit of a shade for it. You can't use filters very easily with this. Now, you can get gigantic box contraptions that take filters on the front. They're fine if you don't use much shift, but the moment you use much shift, it's such a wide angle lens that you're going to get problems from the filter. I don't like filters on a lens like this. I'll use them occasionally on the 24 graduated filters, or more usually neutral density filters, because I want a longer shutter speed, because perhaps I want to blur people. I want to show a place, I want to show people in it. I don't want to draw too much attention to the people, so I use a longer exposure so the people they're moving, they're slightly blurred. Problem with that though is you will always find there is somebody in your shot who didn't move much, somebody who'd stopped to check the phone or something like that. So you'll have a sea of slightly blurred figures and one person clear and sharp looking at the phone or something like that. You do have to keep an eye out for that, because by blurring everyone else you've drawn attention to this one person, which if you wanted to blur everyone in it, you want to blur everyone. Just depends how you want to show the scene. And most of these pictures I don't have people in them. I'm not drawing attention. These are just tests really, just to show this. When I'm doing commercial work, I'm quite interested in people in them quite often, and I quite often want relatively crowded places or busy looking places. If it's just the buildings on their own, doesn't necessarily need people in. But that said, they can make an interesting point. Very wide shot we've got. This is near full shift. We've got a bit of darkening, not too much, bit of darkening at the top here and the bottom here, and that's the giveaway. The bottom one is showing that we're getting a bit of mount vignetting. And I've got these two people waiting to cross the road, and just shot like that. So there you go. Just a few examples of using this Canon TS-E17 on GFX100S. There it is there. You can see the shift on it. That's got a full shift, and you can see that bulbous front element on it. Use with care and it produces excellent results. Another reason why one of these might, if I'm lucky, be replacing my good old Canon 5DS for my architectural work. We shall see. We shall see what happens. But I hope that's been of interest. If you've got any questions, please do let me know. I'll be doing another one of these on a few more lenses whilst I've got the camera here to test. And thanks for watching. Please do subscribe to the channel and all the usual stuff like that. It is appreciated. And if you want to know more about tilt shift lenses, I already mentioned the book. Thanks for watching.